Trust me, I'm gonna love you. God, do I hate when you doubt that? What have I done to show you I am nothing but bad luck? I will prove you wrong. I will show you love. I will give your grief and pain a home again. I will prove you wrong. I will show you love. I will give your hope and trust a place to rest. Rest your little head. Oh,
Good evening. Welcome, everyone, both those who are in the room with us and anyone who is joining us digitally. We are really glad you are here tonight. If this is your first time at Phillips Theological Seminary, we extend a special welcome and hope you will come back soon as you share this time with us. Maybe we can see you again in the future. We welcome you also to this special event, We Belong, Art and Advocacy, in celebration of LGBTQIA+ History Month. For those who haven't met me, and I don't know if that would be anyone in this room, but I'll just remind you, I am Dr. Lisa Davison. I am the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Dean here at Phillips Theological Seminary. Tonight we gather in community to honor the power of art, music, and advocacy, their importance in fostering radical inclusion and extravagant belonging. This evening is a reminder that our shared stories and diverse identities strengthen us and encourage us to create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued. I know that sounds radical here in Oklahoma, but that really is what we're trying to do. We begin tonight with a warm thank you to Ace Stiles, whose art exhibition, yes, an artist in multiple forms. Ace's art exhibition, A Clingy Little Thing, has set the tone for this evening as an expression and as a connection, and also your beautiful music. Ace's work not only captures his own experiences, but speaks to the beauty and complexities of queer life. We're also grateful to Ace, as I just said, for the heartfelt music that opened our program, and we will be treated to one more song at the close of this evening's program. So let's do another round of applause for Ace. I know that Ace brought some friends and family here too, so welcome to each of you as well. It is my great honor to introduce our first speaker this evening, Representative Mauree Turner. Mauree is a groundbreaking leader, the first Muslim and non-binary person elected to public office in Oklahoma. That in and of itself is worthy of applause. Also, they are a tireless advocate for justice. Their work in the Oklahoma legislature and with numerous grassroots organizations has been transformative, focusing on reimagining our justice system and ensuring equitable representation for all. So please join me in welcoming Representative Mauree Turner.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. You would think after 4 years this would get a little bit easier, but it doesn't. I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, just a little bit more, and how I get to be here with you all today, I guess. I was born and raised in Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's now got half the population of Carter County itself, but when I was growing up, it felt like just like a pea in the sea of the world. Everybody knew everybody knew everybody's business. That's small town Oklahoma, it's small town America, I venture. And when they first start asking you what you want to be when you grow up, everybody that was around me, for the most part, was in public health. And so I thought I would have to go into the health field, but I knew from a very young age that I was not a people person. A lot of you have got to see that firsthand for the last 4 years. So I had decided that I was going to become a veterinarian, and I am also a very type A person, and so I grew up my whole life planning on going to vet school. They start asking you what you want to be, veterinarian. When they start asking you to write essays and look up colleges for what you want to be, veterinarian. That had decided that they were going to Oklahoma State University, and then I went to Oklahoma State University to become a veterinarian. I like to think I still work with animals today, just a different type. But the last year, so I went off to Oklahoma State University, veterinary medicine. So the only thing I did was go to classes, go to pre-vet club, and then go back to my dorm room. And most things I like to say I'll try at least once. And so college was one of those things. I talked to my mom at the end of my freshman year, and I was just like, this is, like, I've given it a shot. Like, I don't know if this is the place for me. Like, maybe I should go to a different college or something. And my mom sat me down with my academic advisor, April. My goodness, salt of the universe. And we talked about how I should get involved in more, and, like, what were the things that I enjoyed doing back home. And it was always volunteering. I was a latchkey kid in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Like, if I could volunteer someplace or if I could walk someplace, I was there. I used to spend, this is back like when you could buy food very cheaply, and there was this place called the Old Time Soda Pop Shop, and I would scrounge up coins from the sofa, and I would walk there after school and get a soda and a sandwich. And back when, like, they still had jukeboxes, you know, and so I thought I was really cool. I was the only kid in the shop. I was just walking around town. The very first job that I had was volunteering at the public library. I grew up going to movie days there on Saturday, which was where I fell in love with film, at the public library. And the very first thing I got to do volunteering was hand out pink lemonade and popcorn. And so it was just always like being useful where I could be. And so they tried to figure out some clubs that I could get involved with, which some of you might have heard, but there's this not like volunteer day called the Big Event here in Oklahoma that a lot of the universities do. And so first I started out just volunteering, and then I worked my way up to like leading a volunteer team, to becoming a part of the steering directors, right? And so we got to go out into Stillwater and just do different things, right? Which gave me a way to connect with neighbors in Stillwater, and also like with classmates in a way, because I'm so introverted. I am. And so like unless I'm like tinkering with my hands or something like that, I'm probably a mute. And so gave me a way to kind of connect and experience Stillwater in a different way. At the end of my sophomore year, I was contacted, that feels very formal. This girl walked up to me on campus. Her name was Danielle King, and she was like, I've seen you around, like I think you should come to an NAACP meeting. And I was like, this was funny to me because my senior year of high school, my sister was a freshman at Langston University, and she brought this page home and she said, this is the NAACP, I just signed up for it, like I think you should do it. And I looked at it and I looked at her and I said, that's like not really my thing. and I never signed up for it, and I never batted an eye again until Danielle King walked up to me, which is so funny because over a decade later, almost two, I've made it my entire personality. So I joined the NAACP, and that was another thing where I have told you, I'm type A, so I worked myself up the ranks. I started out as the assistant secretary, ended up as the president for OSU's chapter, and then the president for Oklahoma's youth and college division. And then that was when I realized that like it was so much more than just community organizing, or not community organizing, it was so much more than just like volunteering and being useful. It was community organizing and connecting with the people around me. Like I had said, I was an introvert, because like unless I'm being the hands and feet, right, like then it's hard for me to connect, or maybe that's just the way that I connect, should I say. And so I am doing all of this, and the next organization I hear about is the Council on American Islamic Relations. When the Twin Towers got hit, I was in elementary school and made a solid choice to not tell anybody about my Muslim background. And I never came out in that sense until I was leaving for college. And the choice was that and the choice to start telling folks was that if I told them and they didn't like me or they didn't love me anymore, then I was leaving for college. It couldn't hurt that bad, you know? And I'll never forget the first time I told a friend who, you know, and like we spend our lives like tethering to other youth, right? Our friends are our whole personalities if we're able to make them. And I remember I'm sitting across in a sushi place that started out as the old-time soda pop shop. And I look across the table and I tell a friend and I say, I just want to let you know, like, I'm Muslim. And my friend looks at me and he says, oh, so you're one of those towel heads? And I'll never forget the feeling, because at this point in time, I'd always dressed pretty conservatively because, you know, growing up a trans kid in rural Oklahoma, like, that didn't actually have the language for it just yet. Like, my body never felt like mine. But I never wrapped my hair until I got to college. And so that was a very jarring moment for me. And that would happen one other time. And in the sense that I would tell a friend and they would shut down and shut me out. And so leaving Ardmore and going to Oklahoma State University, that first year and a half felt like my world had crumbled. And I didn't realize, right, that it was really doors on so many closets, to be honest, opening. It gave me, and not even just Stillwater, or I mean, not even just Oklahoma State University, but Stillwater, right, gave me an opportunity to see myself. because also growing up a young queer kid in Oklahoma, making it to college was something I didn't expect, right? Making it through high school was something I didn't expect, let alone middle school, if I'm being honest. So I got to Oklahoma State University, and I got to experience the NAACP, the Council on American Islamic Relations. That was where I got my first college internship, was at CARE. And I also got involved in politics specifically. So my mom always took us to the ballot box with her when we were growing up, because she wanted to impress not only just going to vote, but also understanding that, like, people who represent you, whether or not you voted for, like, they should be hearing from you, right? And we should be invested in who is supposed to be representing us. So I just started paying attention. That just meant I paid attention to student council races in high school. And then I ended up on, like, I guess, like a class representative or something like that in, like, my junior year, which opened the door for me joining student government in college. And sitting in the rooms in SGA in college, there was a moment there that just hit me. It was amongst a line of questioning. Specifically, what happens is that at that point in time, OSU went to what's called Big 12 on the Hill. And we all, like, so many people applied to be able to go. They only select a certain number of students. I think it's like 10. It was like 10 at the time. And I'm sitting in this room full of folks who, their colleges put them up, their respective organizations put them up, things like this. And then it comes to me and folks are like, oh, okay. Like, and I get questions, and yet again, another moment, like, I'll never forget, but they asked me if I felt like I deserved to go. I had become the university's chairperson for the multicultural affairs section of student government. And I'll never forget, like, in the room, a student asked me if I felt like I deserved to go because I was Black. And I think that was the moment that it clicked for me, that these folks are not just the people that I sit in SGA with, but these are the folks who work, like, who go into the legislature in Oklahoma, right? And that was when I decided I would always work on a campaign for a candidate that is worthwhile. And I meant it. I really, really meant it. And so I got involved with State Question 780 and started learning about state questions, started registering students to vote, all these types of things. And it was, I guess, eye-opening, right? Another kind of eye-opening moment for me at Oklahoma State University. As I was getting ready, I was finishing up university serendipitously. A job at the ACLU of Oklahoma had come open. And so this was to become a field organizer to reduce Oklahoma's prison population by 50% and address the racial disparities within it, which sounds really cool. But I think once we engaged in that work, we realized it was so much more than what we thought it was. But it also meant it could be so much more. Right? It meant that we got to look differently about how we engage with our communities. The ACLU of Oklahoma is not a direct service provider, but it meant we got to think creatively about how we make sure that direct service providers are getting the funds, or that community members are getting the funds to engage with direct service providers, right? Because, like, that has always been me, a latchkey kid from small town Oklahoma, trying to figure out how I can bend the rules, not break them, because I am a rule follower, but, like, how do you get really close up to that line that provides a level of care or what you need at that moment in time? And that's what I've been good at. So, in doing all of this, the ACLU decided to give me a job right out of college, which I still look back on, and I'm very thankful that they took a chance on me. And in doing that, we were able to create so many different things, right? roundtables for folks who have been previously incarcerated, because if you've got a felony on your record, it's hard to be in community with people who also have felonies on their record, right? But like, how are you able to find community to figure out where you find housing at, where you get a job at, like all of these things, and people who can just understand you, because we know we love it when we get to sit down at the end of the day and just say, oh my God, can I tell you about something? And your friends say, I know exactly what you mean, you know? So we were able to do things like that, which meant that like, at the beginning, I was just like, hey, I just want to fund some folks to be able to get dinner every now and then. And that's what we did. It started out as just a place for folks to come together and talk. And then they said, so you're having a community conversation? Like, yeah, maybe I do want to go to it. Like, oh, you mean like you want to hear what I have to say? Maybe I do want to speak at it. You think it's worth going to talk to the folks at the legislature? And I'm like, yeah. Like, let's plan something together. And then I say the big question that I think that really kind of shook a lot of us in ways that we didn't know. But I said, like, have you ever thought about running for office? And folks are like, no, I don't think so. Like, I don't look like a stereotypical Oklahoma politician. And I'm like, but that's the point. That's the point, is that people who look like this have been doing this forever. And shouldn't we shake it up? Shouldn't people who look like us, who have to live on the other side of the policies, shouldn't they be the people in the positions? And everyone's like, yes. So then we have to go through all of this red tape to figure out when folks can register to vote again, right? So in Oklahoma, if I am sentenced to 10 years in prison and I get out in 5 for good behavior, I have to serve that other 5 on paper time before I can register to vote again. And if I want to run for office, I have to wait another 15 years before I can run for office. When we hear from politicians day in and day out at the legislature that say like, yeah, I've been to prison, I've been to jail, I've been on both sides of the law, you know, and they tout that as something that's to be remarkable, while other Oklahomans don't get the same access to the legislature as they do, right, as we do. So then folks at this round table started saying like, what about you? Have you ever thought about running for office? Like, we would love to work for you. Or like, it would be so amazing, like we've been doing this work together. And then folks in House District 88 started asking me to run for office. And I don't know if any of you have heard, but like for a woman, the stat is that they have to be asked 7 times to be able to run for office before they start taking themselves as seriously as their communities do. And so when you think about that in a place like Oklahoma, the buckle of the Bible Belt, like what does that look like for a Black, trans, queer, Muslim, you know? Like, and so I'm sitting down and I'm having all these conversations and I'm like, no, that's not me, that's not me. And I think the last thing, like the straw that broke the camel's back, was I received an Instagram message that said like, happy Wednesday, I think you should run for office. And I was like, I responded and I said, I actually don't think this was for me, but thank you, happy Wednesday. But that was the thing too. I started to think, like, all those times, like all the people who reached out to me and said, like, I think you should run for office, or like, we've been doing this work together, I trust you, right, if I can't run for office. And so I said, like, truly, it's one of the most humbling things to be asked, right, for someone to represent you, for someone to say, like, I can't do this myself, right, or I don't want to do this alone, like, will you represent me? And so I sat down and I started to think about it seriously, and I thought, and I talked to my family, because I didn't want to run, like, there's so much there, and I didn't want to run and drag my family into it if they weren't ready either. So my family was okay with it, decided to run in June of 2019, launched a campaign in February of 2020, and won that primary in June of 2020, which was remarkable, also because I ran to the left of a Democrat. So, which is something that a lot of my colleagues do not think highly of, Republican or Democrat. And so it meant that there were going to be more uphill battles than just having to go into a predominantly Republican legislature in Oklahoma. And so I'm supposed to talk to you about like why inclusivity is so important, right? And I think it's important, one, because in a place where, like the buckle of the Bible Belt, where a Black, trans, queer, Muslim kid can get elected, right? It means that our work isn't done, right? for it to happen in 2020, right, it means that in some cases, in some places, our work is just beginning, you know? The downside of it is that it's hard work, right? And I think we often talk about how it's important because I'll say time and time again that organizing saved my life. And I mean it. And relational organizing saved my life, right? The conversations that I could have with friends and family about how to see me wholly, right? About how to understand, right? And about sometimes how it isn't just that you need to understand, it is also the respect aspect of it too, right? Like you might not understand every part of the people that you love, but you love them enough to respect them, right? You love them enough to learn how they survive and beyond just the space between you and I. And that's my job as an elected official, right? And so the relational organizing aspect of it and the inclusivity of it, right, is that in order to be a progressive, right, in order to claim that we are progressive, we have to progress, right? We have to continue to take the next step, even if it is difficult, right? That's the progress. Because I'm here to tell you, right, anybody who has been on the receiving end of any type of bigotry, we understand that like our rights, right, our liberties, if they were just going to give them to us, if whoever is that person, that institution, that oppressor that is up against us, right? Like, if they were going to cede the ground to be a better person, right? To live in humility, to live in grace, understanding, and care, they would have done it by now, right? That it is called a fight, right? A march towards liberation because it is continuous and it is hard work, right? And so, like I was saying, the down part of it is watching how sometimes when your request or your ask or your demand for liberation is not wrapped in a please and thank you or, oh my goodness, I'm just so thankful you were here or you did this, we see people shut down, right? Because the last 4 years have also been filled with conversations of folks that said, well, when you ask me, right, to be inclusive in that way, I just don't feel the need to be inclusive, right? I shut down and I don't want to. But I think what I've also learned in these last 4 years is that when I first started in the legislature, it was during the beginning of COVID, because it is still here and it's still alive and well, right? But the very first phone calls I was greeted with of constituent needs were folks whose unemployment was behind. And sometimes when they called my office, it was the last time, it was their last straw, right? So I'm answering the phone of people who have never talked to me before. This is like my first week on the job. And they're like, I cannot believe you. I cannot believe this state, right? You want to see us fail or die in some instances. I have to keep my lights on. I have to make sure that I can pay my medical bills, all of these things, right? And it's very easy when someone asks you in a negative manner, right, or demands something of you to say like, no, you should be nice. Like, I'm here, I'm trying to help you, be nice. But also realizing that people are coming from so many different circumstances. And if you are asking for something that is long overdue to you, then it is hard to ask everyone in the same nice manner, especially after door after door after door has been shut in your face. So, as a representative, my job, right, is to hear accountability through hurt, right? And that's not just as a representative in the legislature, right, but as a community member who cares, as someone who wants to be the best community advocate there is, or that I could possibly be, right? I am continuously trying to hear that accountability through the hurt. And I'm requiring that my colleagues do the same. So, and in some manners over the last 4 years, the reality is that sometimes when folks aren't ready to meet that accountability, because accountability feels like an attack when you're not ready for it, is that sometimes you will see our loved ones or the people who claim to care for us or claim to represent us, you will see their homophobia grow, their bigotry grow in different ways. And we have to be ready for that too. And I think that was the thing that I was least prepared for over the last 4 years. But I'm hoping, right, that in these next 2 years, in these next 4 years, we understand that we deserve so much more, right? That our liberation isn't bound to an Instagram square, right? It's not bound to a really lovely quote that you post on Martin Luther King Day, right? That it happens year round, right? That Hispanic Heritage Month, that just ended, right? Like that happens year round. Black History Month, that happens year round, right? The learning that we do in those times, right? That happens year round. Because if we are committed to liberation, then we are committed to keeping our communities intact, right? Because if somebody got to cherry pick every time liberation was handed out, I actually couldn't stand here, right? And all of my different demographics, right? And all of the different things that make me unique and make me me. So, and I think that's also part of like destigmatizing and breaking down those closets, right? It is not always about people coming out. It's about people being ready to bring you into the spaces, to the intimate knowing of them, right? Because I'll also say this, like being the first, I knew going into the election that I would be the first Muslim that Oklahoma elected. But I didn't know that I was going to be the first non-binary person elected to a state-level position in U.S. history. I didn't know that until after the November election, and I got a call from a news outlet that was like, we want to talk about this, the first in the nation. I said, me? That couldn't be. I said, I think you have the wrong number. But I think that's important, right? Is that if we care for our neighbors and our friends, right, that we have to also be committed to creating that safety net of care that's between the two of us. We have to be intentional about and committed to making sure that safety net exists beyond just the two of you, right? And I think that's so important, not just as community members, but also for your elected officials, right? Like we represent roughly 39,000 people. And to think that there might not be, that you don't have to do this work, right? Because there might not be a Black, trans, queer, Muslim in your district, like does a disservice to everybody who doesn't have access to 9-to-5 policy, right? Policy that happens February through May, right? And the folks who don't have a good rapport with you outside of the legislative session, right? Because the majority of Oklahomans are working 2 to 3 jobs, right? The majority of Oklahomans probably have to work an overnight shift and doesn't allow them to be able to drive into the Capitol or make it to your virtual office hours in a state that doesn't have broadband access, right, in rural Oklahoma, right? We have to be committed to meeting our communities, our constituencies, our friends, families, and neighbors where they are, right? Because we would want someone to do that for them. We would want to be able to make sure that our friends and our families and our loved ones got to show up wholly, right? That someone didn't say, actually, could you be less queer here? Or actually, could you be less Muslim here? Or actually, like, let's not talk about religion at all, right? Because I would never ask the person I love the most to compartmentalize themselves so I would feel more comfortable, you know? And so, inclusivity is key because it keeps people like Next Benedict alive, right? Inclusivity is key because it keeps people like Fern Galindo alive, you know? I am thankful every day I get to be here, especially after we also leave another World Mental Health Awareness Day, you know? Because sometimes the battle is just waking up and getting out of the bed. And I get to stand here before you because I was just able to do it again today, right? Like, it's hard. And we all know that. We are all struggling with things, right? And if we can understand the struggle that we go through, then we have to be able and willing to extend that grace that we want in those times of struggle. Like, that is important. Grace and restorative justice, right? Because if we continue to isolate ourselves from those around us, then we don't have people to do the work with. And I don't know about you, but a closed door is not the only component of a home. And we are building a home for Oklahomans to live in and for all of us to be able to live in. So, I don't know if that was my full 45 minutes, but I love chatting. I love yapping. That's why they elected me. So, but I love questions. I love conversation too. So any of those I would love to have. Oh, can we just wait 1 minute? Okay. Sorry. That's my best friend and nephew, Anthony. So we go everywhere together. Yesterday we went up to the Gloss Mountains and had lunch.
So how were you received when you first got to the legislative body?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question, in a couple of different ways, I guess. Folks at House District 88 loved it. I'm a community organizer and born and raised in rural Oklahoma, so I think my first line of defense is to always just kind of like do the thing head on. And so before I was elected, I tried to make sure I sat down with as many Democrats as like would talk to me. After I was elected, I sat down with as many Republicans as would talk to me. Because I love to try to meet people where they are. I love to see the things that they talk about, the things that they want to share about. Because I think like that's also a unique package. Like I am a unique package, and so like people always are inclined to share and try to connect on different levels, and I think that's very interesting. But I think like who I am socially and how I get to know people socially is different than the work that I do. And the folks of House District 88 elected me to make sure I kept their demographics, their ideologies, their beliefs intact at every step of the way, right? It meant I didn't compromise on policy, right? It meant that I questioned Democrat and Republican policy, right? It meant that I tried to have the tough conversations about how, if we said in the summer of 2020, if we said Black Lives Matter, if we showed up at those protests, like, what does that mean when we vote on a bill that says, oh, okay, if you honk your horn near a cyclist, right, that is a criminal offense, right? Like, those two things can't exist together, right? And so the initial reception overall that I want to look back on was good, but there were always the outliers. And I think the reception shifted when folks realized that there were things that I wasn't going to back down on behalf of, one, the people of House District 88, but also little Mauree, like baby Reese from Ardmore, Oklahoma, you know? Because like I said, like I'm creating an Oklahoma where nobody has to compartmentalize themselves, right? And that means House District 88 and myself. And I think once folks saw that, I think it got a little harder. So I don't know if that answers your question, though. Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Oh, over here.
Hey, thank you. I'm curious what it means to run to the left of a Democrat in Oklahoma.
That's so funny. So I think what we've got, oh, sorry, we're doing great. I think he's wonderful. So running to the left of a Democrat. But I think ultimately it means just that, right? And so like when I say that I wasn't willing to compromise on those things that keep my communities intact, right, policy-wise, things like that. Because also like, here goes, I guess like the compartmentalization of it all, right? But like, I think specifically being Black and queer in Oklahoma and thinking about the policy that affects those parts of my lives, right? From access to voting, right? Or purging voter rolls, right? Or the cost of being able to contact a loved one in and out of jail, right? What it means to put hate crimes on law, like on the books, like all of these different types of things. Like those were specific battles that we saw my predecessor go ahead and let go, right? Say like, oh, okay, like, yeah, I'll go ahead and like write this amendment to get these people out, and say like, okay, like these folks don't have access to the equitable policy we claim to be putting forward, right? Things like that, and at the time, like House District 88 has been one of the most progressive places to live, I think, in Oklahoma for a very long time, and so I think the guy that I also ran to the left of also was, I think, for all social purposes, the most progressive person we had in the legislature too. But it's one thing to look progressive, and it's a completely different thing to actually be progressive, right? To say like, and actually like this is what it means, right? Because I think about working on State Question 805 back in 2019, 2020. So this was a state question to put an end to sentence enhancements. So like if you go to prison, you get out, you go back before a court for another offense, and they say like, oh, you didn't learn your lesson the first time, so we're going to give you a little bit more time than what is standard for this new charge here, right? And so to be able to work on things like that and legislative packages that allow Oklahoma to have the largest single setting commutation in U.S. history, right, for marijuana offenses and things like that, which 462 people got sent home in one day, right? But there were supposed to be at least 1,000 people that went home, right? And being progressive means that those 1,000 people still go home, right? It means fighting to make sure, because if we say that we've got friends on the other side of the aisle, then are they friends if we only are able to help them, right, when they are trying to get a policy packet passed, right? And they're just folks that pat us on the back when it's our time, right? And so anyway, so that's running to the left. I think it's also just being Muslim in the Oklahoma legislature too, maybe, or something that is not Christian, right? Someone who is not Christian. So, anybody else? Any questions? Oh, I mean, I don't know if folks know, I think a couple of things I will say, right? Like, things that I don't mind talking about, I think sometimes people are like, oh, okay, like, I don't want to ask the question. Like, I did get censured back in 2023. It's something I don't mind talking about if you have a question about it. If you want to talk about it later, we can talk about that, too. I also did not run for re-election, so I won't be back in the legislature in 2025. And I find out that every day that there are folks who still don't know that. So we'll say that, too. But yeah, I love questions, love chit chat, love gossip. So if you want to catch me after this, that's my favorite thing. And right now it's just Anthony and I who share it. So, but anyway, so yes, it's been the honor of my life to be able to serve the people of House District 88 and specifically, and the people of Oklahoma as a whole. I think, to be completely honest, every day I still get messages of folks who come from all over the state, it was a tough decision to leave at this moment in time, like very, very tough decision. But I want to see this one grow up, and so I want to focus on that for now. Yeah.
Well, good evening. I'm Dr. Lisa Barnett, Assistant Professor of American Religious History and Director of Formation for Disciple Students at Phillips Theological Seminary. And it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Reverend Luther Young. Reverend Young is an artist, public theologian, and social justice advocate whose work challenges systemic inequality and fosters inclusion. As an ordained minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the pastor of worship and spiritual formation at Lighthouse Church of Chicago United UCC, there we go. Luther's ministry speaks powerfully to intersections of race, class, and LGBTQ plus justice. His recent scholarship on homophobia in the Black church a dissertation almost to the end at The Ohio State University, yay. But that scholarship on homophobia in the Black church provides critical insights into how we can address non-affirmation in faith spaces, while his leadership as a moderator in the Disciples LGBTQ+ Alliance, commonly called Alliance Q, that continues to create space for marginalized voices within the church. And we are grateful to have Reverend Young with us tonight to share his wisdom and his passion for justice. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Luther Young.
Good evening, everyone. If you ever need someone to introduce you, I recommend Dr. Barnett. That is quite an introduction. Thank you. Can we take this show on the road? All right. It is my honor to be with you all tonight and to share a few thoughts around belonging. In an age where deception and violence are ever present, we long for safety and security. And this is particularly true in the virtual sphere, as cyber attacks and identity theft are unfortunate realities in our ever-growing digital age. See, lots of folks in here have good smartphones and all the latest technology. And so to combat these security threats, companies implement security checks such as two-factor authentication or declining seemingly suspicious charges on your debit card until they can call you and verify that it's you. For me, it was always when I was in my neighborhood that they would decline stuff and then call me. Is that you? Yes, I'm down the street trying to get gas. Can I get my gas? Websites will often employ CAPTCHA technology that requires visitors to solve a puzzle or a riddle or perform some other task to confirm that they're a human and not a computer. And these CAPTCHA boxes sometimes have little pithy descriptions like, I'm not a robot, which is often ironic because a robot is asking you to confirm whether or not you're a robot, right? This past week, I logged into a website and I was presented with one of these CAPTCHA boxes. But this time it had a description that I hadn't seen before. It said across the top of the page, prove your humanity. And below this bolded text was a checkbox that had to be selected before advancing to the next screen. Y'all, this CAPTCHA gave me pause. So much pause that I wrote this talk about it. Because how many of us have had our humanity questioned? Not necessarily by a computer program, but by relatives who claim to love us, or community members who believe they're good people, or by mentors who are supposed to pour into us, or by politicians, not the one we just heard, but those who claim to have our best interests at heart, and by churches that are supposed to nurture us. Many of us know what it's like to just go about our business and then be met by some gatekeeper who, under the guise of security and safety, will question our right to exist. Society questions the humanity of immigrants, well, certain immigrants, by labeling them as criminals or freeloaders or people who steal jobs, siphon public resources, and potentially consume pets. Society calls into question the humanity of women by denying their numerous contributions to every aspect of our society, viewing them as sandwich-making eye candy and taking away their ability to make decisions about their own health care. For centuries, this country has questioned the humanity of African Americans by legally defining us as 3/5 of a person, labeling us as inherently unintelligent and dangerous, and subjecting us to constant surveillance and state-sponsored violence. Trans folk constantly have their humanity questioned by people who disavow their experiences, label them as menacing wolves in sheep's clothing lurking in public bathrooms, and then try to legislate them out of existence. Society uses misinformation and fear to justify questioning and even denying the fundamental humanity of particular groups of people, to assert that they don't belong. And let's be clear, this is not about people not liking other people. This is an intricately designed system to keep certain people in power, allowing them to hoard resources. And this system will have us competing for a piece of a proverbial pie while they work to close the pie factories and they get to enjoy their private pastry chefs. Those in the highest positions of power will hope that they can keep disadvantaged folks distracted by petty debates and unwarranted jealousy fueled by fear. And if, after having our humanity questioned, we dare to demand dignity and respect, we are often burdened with proving our humanity. We have to check the right boxes before we're allowed to move on with our lives. Racial, gender, sexual, and other minorities know firsthand what it's like to constantly have to review someone else's checklist, having to prove that we're smart enough, or pretty enough, or accomplished enough, or strong enough, or worthy enough to belong in certain spaces. We have to work twice or 3 or 4 times as hard to dispel stereotypes and assumptions. We have to prove that we're not bad people when others are just assumed to belong. Other folks have the benefit of the doubt, but we have the burden of proof. Societal captures to gatekeep who can move forward, who can pursue the fullness of life, liberty, and happiness, whose humanity gets to be affirmed, demanding that we check the appropriate boxes. And many of us do try to fit in. You know, we wear the right clothes. We choose a hairstyle that is more professional. Well, I didn't. We adopt the proper colloquialisms. We get into the prestigious schools. We join the desirable social clubs. We even choose the more trendy or the more stately churches. We do our best to try and prove that we belong. And this is what many of our movements for social justice historically have been founded on. Black folks in America in the 1950s and 60s used nonviolent resistance and respectability as a strategy to foreground the civility of African Americans vis-a-vis the brutality of legalized racism. Gay rights activists in the 90s and 2000s advanced a message of, we're just like you, framing same-gender relations almost exclusively within the context of monogamous marriage as a way to argue for the inherent worth of queer people. And these attempts were to check a box in order to move forward, and they certainly moved the needle. But we have yet to eventuate permanent social change, as racism and homophobia are still prevalent. Now, I want to be clear. I don't deny the importance of and the effectiveness of movements that came before. And I recognize that not all folks who were involved in these movements aligned with that kind of thinking, and that some had a more inclusive strategy. And there is nothing, hear me, there's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to fit in or enjoying certain comforts in life. I personally love nice things. I understand completely doing what you have to do in order to get by. I know that sometimes we have to operate within the system in order to make progress. Yet, we must remember that this alone will not guarantee liberation. Many of us have heard Audre Lorde's infamous words, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." But we don't often hear the sentence that comes after that. It says, "They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." In other words, strategizing within the system won't change the system, but using the master's tools can help us gain some advantages, to get our feet under us, to buy some time, to gain momentum. It is a tool at our disposal, but not necessarily the rule. Because when we encourage marginalized folks to make themselves more palatable to hegemonic systems, we reinforce narrow boundaries of belonging. When we advance a sort of model minority mentality, we further disadvantage members of our own community. Although the fight for gay marriage was an important one, focusing almost completely on marriage as an ultimate goal for equality only legitimized certain identities while inadvertently demonizing other folks who could not or would not follow the prescribed order of respectability. So in other words, the good gays were those who have monogamous relationships and have relationships that are legible to the straights, whereas those who date casually were devalued, or those who didn't want to get married were often overlooked. So friends, might we consider the ways in which mantras like "love is love" might legitimate intimacy in certain forms, particularly within the context of committed relationships, but how that might inadvertently disparage queer pleasure for pleasure's sake? Could it be that touting love in marriage as a gold standard might perpetuate the same kinds of purity culture that we might find problematic? Not to mention that such a narrow focus has contributed to bi erasure, trans and non-binary exclusion, avoidance of racial inequalities, and further oppression of the disabled and differently abled. There is no marriage equality until it includes disabled people. Again, my intention is not to discredit the work that has been done, nor to devalue the institution of marriage. I think it is important. But I do, however, challenge us to think more critically, to recognize the fatal logical flaw in believing that checking someone else's boxes will lead to our liberation. And we should consider how we can expand our boundaries of belonging. When I think about completing online captcha challenges, like we said earlier, the irony of it all, that a robot is asking me to prove that I'm not a robot, right? I mean, it's kind of hilarious, if not nonsensical. How can a person or entity that does not have a particular lived experience demand someone else to prove their experience? For instance, a cisgender person telling a trans person to prove they're trans and not cisgender is just as nonsensical as a robot telling a human to prove they're a human and not a robot. Cisgender men legislating the reproductive rights of women and birthing persons is nonsensical. The rich dictating the lifestyles of the poor is ridiculous. People trying to tell you how to live your lives, telling you what you do and don't deserve, gatekeeping your success and happiness and pleasure is asinine. My friends, trying to prove your humanity to other flawed humans is futile, because the burden of proof will always be too great. So then, what do? If fitting in won't save us, if playing by someone else's rules won't guarantee victory, if checking the right boxes won't bring about permanent change, what is our resource? I'm glad you asked. Friends, our remedy is resistance. And we must realize that effective resistance should be ubiquitous, but not uniform. It doesn't have to look the same for all people and at all times. Resistance can look like saying, to hell with your boxes, and choosing to affect change from outside the prescribed systems. Resistance may take a burn it all down approach, that reform is not possible or preferable, and that abolition is the only path forward. And resistance can also look like choosing to check some boxes in order to strategically position oneself to promote change within institutions. It can look like marginalized folks doing what they have to do in order to ensure their safety and the security of their loved ones. It can look like taking a prescribed social norm and queering it instead of throwing it out, to envision new ways of thinking and to use our creative imagination as a compass for change. And all of these methods are valid. They are all useful. They're all necessary, and they should all be celebrated. There is no singularly correct way to resist. But in order for our resistance to be effective, it must be rooted in courage and authenticity. No matter how you choose to move in the world, regardless of whether you opt to operate within or without existing institutions, be true to yourself. Honor yourself. Enjoy yourself. Live life to the fullest as much as possible, and push back when others try to prevent your thriving. Your resistance, your happiness is resistance. Queer love is resistance. Black joy is resistance. Trans visibility is resistance. Your existence is resistance. In a society that questions the humanity of certain groups of people, in a world that burdens so many with having to prove their worth, remember this. If you don't remember anything else from this talk, remember this. You don't have to prove anything to anybody. You don't have to check another person's boxes because you've already checked the one that matters. When the Creator formed you, they sealed your humanity. The Holy One has searched and known you. When they formed your inward parts and knit you together, the price tag read priceless because you were fearfully and wonderfully made. The burden of proof is not on you to verify your humanity. Rather, it is your right, and I dare say your obligation, to demand the dignity and respect that you deserve. But, beloved, we must remember that just as we are not obligated to check anyone else's boxes, folks aren't obligated to check ours either. I'll let that one sit in. Folks are not obligated to check our boxes either. One of the things that grieves me about progressive spaces or spaces that center the experiences of marginalized folks is that they can be just as violent and intolerant as those they criticize. The amount of vitriol and exclusivity and the denial of humanity I see in so many so-called justice movements is sickening. If it's not okay when they do it, it's not okay when you do it. Doesn't matter if you feel as though you're right or that your cause is just. It is never okay to demonize or dehumanize anyone, period. It is not okay to exclude folks from our resistance and liberation efforts because we disagree with their perspectives or we don't understand their experience. It's a shame that gays and lesbians can be some of the most transphobic people. It's baffling how some people of color can be so xenophobic. It breaks my heart to observe queer-centered spaces that are classist and ableist. Makes me cringe when folks attack the personhood of others because of their political affiliations. Now, by all means, call out foolishness. By all means, oppose policies and legislation that harm and kill. We should certainly call out people for their hatred and oppressive stances, but we can do so without calling them out of their name. Because no matter how awful you think they are, how you treat people is a reflection of you and not them. Our resistance cannot only include the folks that make us comfortable. There is no true freedom until there is freedom for all. And this includes folks who may not think the way we do. They may not be as progressive as us. This includes the elderly and children. This includes the unhoused and sex workers and those battling addiction and non-monogamous folks and our trans and non-binary siblings and our international siblings. It just can't be the people who check our boxes. Because if we're truly honest, our boxes are just as bigoted as any other. And we will never be free until we loose ourselves from the chains of virtue signaling and trendy activism. Questioning people's humanity is the enemy of justice and the antithesis of belonging. As we strive for a world that celebrates diversity, seeks equity, promotes inclusion, and advocates for justice, I encourage us to bring belonging to the center. Belonging is critical and distinct from the other components of our DEI plus acronyms. You see, diversity is simply different people. Affirmation is endorsing their personhood regardless of difference. Equity is different people having what they need. Justice is folks getting what they deserve. Inclusion is giving those folks a place at the table. Welcoming involves a desire for them to be there in the first place. But belonging necessitates a transfer of ownership. When a person belongs, the space is now theirs, and they share equal proprietary rights with everyone else. Belonging shifts power in ways that cannot support oppression. When everyone belongs, no one goes without. When everyone belongs, no one is cast aside. When everyone belongs, no one is dehumanized. When everyone belongs, war and genocide have to cease. When everyone belongs, police brutality and state-sanctioned violence and profit-driven mass incarceration cannot continue. When everyone belongs, we all have abundant lives. We are not robots checking for other robots. We are people called to love and care for other people. The gatekeeping of who belongs and who doesn't is evil and ineffective. It provides a false sense of security to the privileged while enacting violence upon the disenfranchised. So let's do away with societal captchas. We are all human beings. And it shouldn't require check boxes to recognize the humanity of others. Thank you. I believe we have time for questions, so feel free to ask me anything you'd wish.
Thank you, Luther. I know your work, you made a comment about the intersections of racism and homophobia, and you threw out a lot of other intersections that we have to consider. And so I'm just wondering, as someone in theological education looking ahead for pastors, for churches and stuff, what should we be doing to try to help bring that respect for diversity within the church? I mean, do you have any advice based upon your own research, your own position as moderator in Disciples Q?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, there are a couple of approaches to this. One of the things, if anyone has been or has become acquainted with the Building an Inclusive Church Toolkit, which is the tool that Alliance Q and others, similar organizations, other denominations have similar organizations, will use, one of the things that is in that toolkit at the beginning is this understanding that when we have conversations around inclusion, being welcoming and affirming, whether we're talking about LGBTQ plus issues or otherwise, is to start from a place of graceful engagement. And I think what I would add to that is kind of what I've lifted up here this evening is starting from a place that we are recognizing someone else's humanity, right? And I think, so many times when we have conversations around whether it's sexuality or any of the other hot button political topics, right? People like to come from either a scriptural argument or a fiscal argument or it's just not practical or it's too expensive or even a moral. It's wrong. It is just wrong. I think it is always helpful to center around the fact that we are talking about people's lives. And I think encouraging folks to come back to that piece. Secondly, these beliefs don't emerge in a vacuum. And so particularly in my work with homophobia in predominantly Black churches, one of the things that I always go back to is it's important because, folks will say, Black churches and arguably even Black people, and this can go to other communities of color, just homophobic, right? It's just they're just homophobic, and it just is what it is. And when I started my research, my question was kind of like, well, is it? Is that really the case, or is there more happening? And with that is a conversation about the socio-historical context, right? Understanding how beliefs around gender and sexuality and sexual orientation among Black communities have emerged alongside a long-standing history of slavery and violence that included sexual violence and violence that included forced sexual violence of we often hear about enslaved African women being assaulted, but enslaved African men were also assaulted in really nefarious ways, and how that, in combination with a desire for being seen as respectable citizens in society, how all of this kind of merged to create both really conservative sexual ethics along with this kind of fear of homosexuality that's rooted really in a fear of sexual violence. And how that then has been compounded by histories of mass incarceration and addiction and poverty. How all of these things have just been happening over centuries that lend itself to what we see now. Important part. And then two, the last thing I'll say is never underestimate people's ability to allow their humanity to take the driver's seat. I've encountered really interesting situations where someone may have been very vocally opposed to LGBTQ plus inclusion, but at the same time, when someone that they have, say for instance, we're in a classroom setting, their colleague or their classmate encounters homophobia or transphobia, they'll be the first one to jump to their defense, right? Because although I may have certain opinions ideologically, I know this person, and I don't like the mistreatment of this person that I know. Goes back to that first point about starting with personhood. One of the things that it's an interesting statistic, me being a sociologist, we like stats, right? What we find is that the rates of anti-LGBTQ sentiments among Black folks is actually declining. I mean, it's declining for all groups, but it's particularly declining for African Americans in really unique ways, such that some would argue it's because of a shared understanding of oppression. So you'll see that among Black folks, they may say that I believe homosexuality is wrong, but I still support LGBTQ plus rights because I know what it's like to have my rights denied, right? And you see this changing in even the discourse in Black churches, right? So when marriage equality became the law of the land, it was complicated for Black churches because it was like, Obama's our guy. And so we kind of want to support him, but we don't know if we can really support this. Now, what do we do? And you can see the discourse in a lot of particularly Black churches shift to say, well, was one pastor, he was quoted in saying like, Obama is in charge of the rights, R-I-G-H-T-S, but here I'm in charge of the rights, R-I-T-E-S. And so while I may not agree with, we don't agree with that as a right, R-I-T-E, in this church. We're not marrying gay people, but we can support the rights of people to do that, right? And you start to see that discourse change around 2010 when that shift starts to happen. And that's kind of been a similar discourse, even starting to emerge in other areas. So in my dissertation, there was one church that I observed as part of my project that was incredibly conservative, very much so. But they were vocally they were vocally a pro-choice church, which was really fascinating in really interesting ways. So say all that to say, never underestimate someone's ability to allow their humanity to jump in the driver's seat when you least expect it. Thanks for that question.
First of all, thank you very much for that talk. It was, that word belonging really resonated a lot, so I am going to be using it a little bit more. But I was thinking as you were talking about the issue in Black churches and women having leadership positions in those churches, and how does that intersect with the disassociation of the LGBTQ community within the church as well? Does that make sense? Because it seems like there's a little bit of a hypocrisy there within the church.
You said that, not me. So that is a really interesting point, and thank you for raising that. One of the so I'll say one thing first. So sociologically speaking, one of the chapters of my dissertation really explains the framework of heteropatriarchy, and I won't bore you with a lecture on all that sort of theory. But basically what I find, and this has been supported by other research, is that there's a correlation between congregational beliefs around gender equality and LGBTQ plus inclusion, right? So like there is some correlation that churches that are more progressive when it comes to the role of women in the church and leadership, and their likelihood of being queer affirming. And particularly the other direction is where it's most strong, right? Like if they don't believe in women in ministry and like don't support the role of women, then they are not going to be down with the gays. So that is a really it's interesting also too, because to your point, right, in order to get to a place of affirming the role of women in the church or just in the women in society, it requires a level of biblical exegesis and hermeneutics that I think is important. But it is interesting how that can be so selective. And I also find kind of anecdotally, right, even talking to my clergy colleagues who, I'm like, when are y'all going to welcome queer folks in your church, right? And I've had several of them tell me, well, I got to start with letting them get women in the pulpit first, right? So it's almost like this, it's the typical kind of progression first, right? It's like, well, okay, first we got to give white women rights. Then we can give all women rights. And then, we can maybe let the gays in, but not the trans. You know what I mean? So it's like this progression that has to happen that people feel needs to be a thing that I personally don't get. I'm just like, if we all gonna be free, let's all be free. But I think in Black context, there is this desire to hold on to traditional conservative beliefs for the sake of respectability, right? And even in, Dr. Barnett and I were talking about this earlier, there's some research on queer Black folks. If you look at like Krista McQueenie's work is a good example. But like folks saying that I want to go to a church that, doesn't say that gays are going to hell every Sunday. But I also want to go to a church where it's traditional and I want to have a pastor and a first lady. And, I want that. And I'm like, wow, can we unpack that a bit more? And so like there is still this desire to have and we've been socialized, unfortunately, in the society such that no matter how progressive spaces are, there are still these vestiges of, there's one of the other churches in my dissertation that I observed, I call them welcoming at best. I think some of them think that they're affirming. I call them welcoming at best. And even in that space, right? So like they have, LGBTQ plus members of the church and, they have, I think, an LGBT ministry. I don't think it's active, but they have one on the books. And I was talking to one of the pastors and I was like, yeah, how does the church welcome LGBTQ? Oh, yes, we do. Yes, we do. What about in leadership? Oh, yes, we have gay people in leadership and LGBTQ people in leadership. What about in pastoral leadership? Well, no, not pastoral leadership now. So that was kind of a bar. But one of the things that was really fascinating was gender dynamics in that space. So I asked, one of the things that this church does is baby dedications, and lots of churches do them, but theirs are like really important to the church. It is an event. And one of the things that happens during the baby dedication is that, you have presumably a heterosexual couple. And there's a point in the service where the father goes up to the stage with the child and presents it. It's very like Lion King style, like you raise the child. It has its roots in African traditions, right? So it's like they are very intentional about this thing. But I noticed, I had been and observed a few of them, and it was always, the father goes up and presents the child. And I remember there was a couple that I think had like twins or at least two very small children. And I was like, well, he can't hold up both of them kids. What they gonna do? I think it was his brother that went up, because I was like, are they going to let the mom go up with him, right, to do this. Nope. It was like, I think, a brother or somebody that went up, right? So I remember asking this pastor about that. I was like, so have you had, all the couples I observed were heterosexual. So I said, have you had queer couples come to dedicate their church? Oh, yes, absolutely. And it was so beautiful that when it was a lesbian couple, and it was so great, and it was so beautiful. And when it came time to present the child, the godfather went up and presented the child on their behalf. And I was like, huh. Right? So even in this progressive space, the need to adhere to the traditional, historical, and in this context, the African traditions that it has to be a male that goes forth, superseded their progressiveness, right? I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like it pointed to, what do we do about that? I don't know. Give me a few years and I may come back and say I don't know again. So, all righty. Thank y'all so much.
So, as we come to the close of this evening, thank you to each of you for being here. Your presence and engagement with our evening and our speakers has just reminded us all of the power of belonging. A special thanks to our guests, Ace Stiles, that you get to hear from one more time, Representative Turner, and Reverend Young for sharing art, stories, and wisdom with us. Your voices, your different artistic gifts certainly inspire us to continue working toward a world where every person's humanity is affirmed, where everyone is embraced in love and dignity, and that there are no exceptions. No exceptions. So before we close with another song, I wanted to just do one commercial. I apologize, but this is what they would pay me to do. We have another special event coming up in November. On November 12th, we will have an evening with Joy Harjo. If you are not familiar with Joy Harjo, she is a former U.S. Poet Laureate. And an Indigenous person, and we are really excited about the evening we get to spend with Joy and the other things that will happen around her presence among us. Registration is supposed to open this evening, so pull out your phones when we're done and register for the event. And we hope you will join us in November, and keep an eye out for all the different events we have on our schedule, Remind and Renew, the Tulsa Race Massacre Lecture, and lots of things in between. So as we leave tonight, may we carry forward with us the spirit that we hope this gathering has inspired, about building spaces, homes, if you will, where every person belongs. And may we go forth with the intention and the courage to do active work to make that a reality that we can see in this location and beyond. So thank you again. We hope you'll come back if this was your first time, and I will leave you in the capable musical hands of Ace. Thank you.
Hi again. Yeah, I've got one more song for you guys. I want to say I'm thankful to be here with you all. And I am far from the first queer person to sit on a stage and croon their hearts out. So it's so great to see people here to celebrate them and every queer person out there. This is a song about the future. Baby's coming in from the backyard, playing in the mud, and you're right behind her, picking her up. She's got your hair, and she's got my eyes, she's got my freckles, and she's got your smile. I am home. White linens, off-white tables sitting in the window light, wallpaper from the olden times. I grab your face to make sure you're real, seeing all the lovely dreams we can build. I foresee a good life. I see you and me sitting in our chairs, staring up at heaven's stairs, holding hands. I see our children and our grandchildren, still our legacy in the life we built. I am home. And we cry, happy with our little life. And we cry, I foresee Thank you.